10:47 at night, the only sound in Dominic Vale's office was my pen scratching paper and my own breath refusing to settle. Marble under my heels, glass behind me, Manhattan shining like it didn't know my name. I held the contract like a lifeline and a leash tonight. I wasn't there because I wanted luxury or power. I was there because my daughter, Emmy, wheezed through another midnight attack last week, and the hospital plan sat on my kitchen table like a verdict. $80,000. Add my custody lawyer's retainer, $15,000, and my choices disappeared in a single week. Dominic arrived 20 minutes late, not rushed, not apologetic, as if time bent around him. Charcoal suit, shoulders squared, eyes dark and calm. He didn't greet me so much as confirm I existed. The room felt colder, unlike his presence rewrote the thermostat, and my spine learned to stay upright. He scanned the final page the way men scan quarterly reports, looking for risk, not meaning. My hand shook when I signed, but I kept my wrist locked and my face blank. I refused to beg with my eyes. If I cracked, I'd never stop, and he would see it. He spoke in careful, measured phrases about appearances, timelines, and discretion, like our lives were boxes to be checked. I listened and nodded because nodding was cheaper than arguing. What kind of man needs marriage the way others need guards? One who expects attacks, I guessed even in his office. When I finished, he didn't look at my name on the page like it mattered. He looked past me, toward the door, toward whatever empire waited outside. Before leaving, he delivered one last instruction, and cold as ice. I should remove the wedding costume and remember my place before I slept. The door clicked shut, soft and final, and the city glittered beyond the windows like it had no opinion. I stood still until my lungs remembered how to work. I had been called worse by kinder men, but this one hurt because it was so effortless and I needed him. I reminded myself this was not romance. It was medicine and paperwork, inhalers and court dates. It was me being the adult when no adult showed up for me. Emmy was asleep at my mother's place, clutching her stuffed rabbit, trusting I could fix everything without letting her see fear. I folded my copy of the contract and slid it into my bag like contraband. The paper was thin, but it weighed more than any suitcase. His cologne lingered, cedar and something darker, as if power had a scent. I promised myself I would survive this, then left without bowing. In the back of the rideshare, I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed. My mother had texted a prayer emoji. I didn't answer. I sent Emmy a voice note instead, light and cheerful, telling her I loved her. The lie tasted like pennies, but it kept her safe. The car crossed into the Upper East Side, and buildings rose like polished teeth. Somewhere above those streets waited a penthouse I'd never earned, paid for with my fear. I tried to picture Dominic living there alone, all edges and silence. I couldn't. I knew I was moving in tonight. His dismissal replayed itself in my head, not as words, but as a temperature drop. I had agreed to be a wife on paper, not a shadow in my own life. I pressed my palm to my thigh and promised myself Emmy would never feel small because of my choices. At a red light, I opened the document again, hunting for anything I'd missed. Most of it was cold logistics, events, photographs, shared addresses. Then I saw it, tucked under security. A full page about Emmy. Not just school pickup protocols, but restrictions on who could contact her, and when. My stomach tightened. This wasn't the kind of clause you add for comfort. It read like a plan written by someone who had watched danger circle a family. I imagined unseen cameras, vetted drivers, names on lists. Dominic Vale didn't marry for love. He married for defense, and I understood. The doorman opened a door I couldn't afford to touch. The lobby smelled like lilies and money. Cameras blinked. A guard nodded at my name as if he'd practiced it. My keycard waited in an envelope, neat black ink. Dominic's world hadn't started tonight. It had been moving toward me. In the private elevator, my reflection looked too calm for what I'd done. I smoothed my coat and imagined the penthouse above, perfect and untouchable, a museum built to keep fingerprints off the glass. Marion would be waiting with rules. I swallowed as the doors opened into light. No mercy. I carried one suitcase and a calm I didn't trust. Dominic had reduced me to a role, yet the contract had named Emmy under security. When the elevator opened, I understood. I wasn't moving into a home. I was moving into a fortress, and I didn't know why until now. The elevator opened straight into the penthouse, and then light spilled out like I had stepped into a showroom after closing hours. Glass walls held the skyline in place, flawless and distant. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and something chemical, like cleanliness had a budget. Every surface shone, stone counters, pale rugs, a dining table too perfect to eat at. I rolled my suitcase across the floor, and the wheels sounded loud, almost rude. The place was beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful, with signs you cannot see that still say, "Do not touch," not even breathing. Marion Shaw appeared from a corridor as if she had been waiting behind the walls. Silver hair, crisp suit, tablet in hand, eyes that measured me without curiosity. She moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, explaining schedules, elevators, deliveries, security codes, and which doors were not mine. The rules came wrapped in politeness, but they were still rules, already decided. A calendar had been loaded onto my phone, appointments stamped with my name like ownership. She reminded me Mr. Vale valued privacy and that questions belonged in the proper channels, meaning her. When she finished, my freedom felt smaller. I carried my suitcase into the room Marion called mine, and chose not to gasp, even though the closet was bigger than my first apartment. I unpacked slowly, placing my worn paperbacks on the nightstand first, like a flag. I set my jar of instant coffee beside the machine, because I needed something that tasted like my own life. In the closet, I taped Emmy's crayon drawing to the inside panel where no guest would see it, a crooked sun over stick figures. I slipped her inhaler case into my purse and promised myself this place would not erase us. Later, alone, I wandered the living room and ran my fingers along Dominic's built-in shelves. The books were arranged by subject, not author, like everything in his life needed categories. Architecture and business made sense. History, too. What surprised me was the poetry, slim volumes tucked between heavier titles. One fell open to a page bent at the corner, the crease careful, not careless. Another had a line underlined twice in pencil, as if he came back when the world changed. What kind of man builds a home that doesn't look lived in, yet keeps poems like bandages for himself? By evening, the penthouse had taught me its silence. The HVAC breathed softly, and the city's distant horns filtered up through sealed windows. Dominic was gone. Marion said he kept irregular hours, and I believed her because the space felt designed for one person. I ate takeout at the counter rather than the long dining table, refusing to pretend I belonged in a staged photograph. When I woke the next morning, the only evidence of him was a rinsed coffee cup on the rack and a trace of cedar near the entry. I started noticing those traces like weather outside. He returned late, the elevator hum announcing him before I heard footsteps. The doors opened and he walked in with a leather portfolio, coat still on, face composed in that practiced way. For a fraction of a second his gaze caught on me at the kitchen counter, as if he had not expected the museum to contain a living person. The look was not warmth, but it wasn't nothing either. Then it snapped shut. He passed with controlled distance, me phone already in hand, and disappeared into his office. I heard one door click, then silence that felt heavier than sound. Near midnight I drifted toward the terrace, needing air more than answers. Through the glass I saw Dominic at the railing, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a dark drink that caught city light. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't performing. His shoulders looked less like a king and more like a man bracing against something invisible. I stood there for 3 slow seconds, then kept walking, because watching felt like trespassing. In my room, I tried to read, but my attention kept returning to the apartment's language. The elevator's sigh, the click of doors, distant steps. Before bed, I opened the closet and found something I hadn't unpacked. A small blanket folded with hospital corner precision, on pastel and soft, child-sized. No tag, no note. It sat on the shelf like a quiet admission that Emmy existed in this fortress, whether I said her name or not. My throat tightened with a question I refused to ask. Who prepared it, and why? In the morning, my phone buzzed with Marion's calendar alert for a rooftop fundraiser, my first night as Mrs. Vale. I stared at the reminder and understood the penthouse wasn't a home. It was a stage. Rooftops in Manhattan have a way of making you forget the ground exists until the wind reminds you. The fundraiser was held on a glass terrace high above the river, wrapped in heat lamps and soft jazz that drifted between conversations like perfume. Every laugh sounded practiced. Every clink of a crystal glass felt like a signature. I stepped out of the elevator and felt 100 eyes land, and then slide away, measuring what kind of woman Dominic Vale had placed beside his name. I wore a red dress that didn't beg for attention. It fit clean, no sparkle, no drama, the kind of choice you make when you plan to survive the night instead of enjoy it. I had pinned my hair back, kept my makeup simple, and repeated one rule in my head: be warm, not open. Dominic arrived beside me as if he'd been built for rooms like this. The crowd shifted before he moved. Men straightened their jackets, women recalculated their smiles, and the security detail blended into the background like shadow. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. His presence was a boundary line everyone could see. I tried to do my part. I nodded at introductions, remembered names long enough to send them back with the right tone, and kept my hands steady around my drink. And I thought about Emmy only once, when a woman's bracelet chimed and it sounded like an inhaler cap snapping shut. I swallowed the memory and kept smiling. Then Graham Sloane stepped into my space. He looked like money pretending to be friendly, hair perfect, cufflinks bright, eyes too sharp to be kind. He greeted me with the sort of charm that comes with a hidden blade. His words circled my marriage the way sharks circle a boat, curious about what bleeds. He implied I'd appeared too suddenly, that men like Dominic didn't marry without leverage, that I must be very useful. He let his gaze travel, slow enough to be deliberate, and I felt my skin tighten with contained rage. I offered polite responses that said nothing. I shifted half a step away. He followed, as if the distance was an invitation. The jazz trio changed to something slower. Wayne and the wind off the river cut through the warm air, cold fingers on my shoulders. I recognized the trap. If I snapped, I would look unstable. If I softened, I would look available. Either way, he won. What does it mean when protection starts to feel like possession, and you can't tell which one you need? I felt Dominic before I saw him, the way the room quieted a fraction at his approach. His hand settled at my lower back, firm and unhurried. The touch wasn't intimate. It was declarative. A line drawn in heat against fabric. Graham's smile held for a heartbeat, then thinned, because the message wasn't for me. It was for him, and for anyone watching. Step back. My pulse jumped anyway. I hated that my body reacted to a man who had told me I was a role. I hated that the warmth of his palm made my breath catch. I hated most of all that I felt safer the moment his fingers pressed, as if my nervous system trusted him before my pride could object. Graham retreated with a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes, and the people around us pretended they hadn't noticed the shift. That was the trick of these events. Threats wore tuxedos. Victories looked like manners. Dominic kept his hand there as we moved toward the railing. The skyline spilled out below, lights stacked like constellations someone had sold. I stared at the city to keep from staring at his hand. The wind tugged at my dress, and for a second the night felt honest, stripped of polished smiles. His touch lingered one beat too long, then lifted away with the precision of a man closing a door quietly. The air rushed into the space it left. I turned my face slightly, while catching the edge of his profile, the tight line of his jaw, the controlled stillness that looked like restraint. He said nothing aloud. Still, I felt the meaning settle between us. He had intervened because he chose to. Back at the penthouse, Marion met me in the hallway with the calm of someone who catalogs danger for a living. In her careful phrasing, I heard what she didn't want to say directly. Graham wasn't just a flirt. He was tied to a rival faction that watched Dominic for weakness. Tonight hadn't been a social inconvenience. It had been a test. I stood there a moment, wondering who taught a man like him to speak in silence, and why my heart kept answering back anyway. In my room, I pulled back the curtain to let in the city glow, and my chest tightened. On the outer ledge of the window sat a single white rose. I'd laid straight as a promise. No note, no ribbon. Just a quiet, impossible softness in a world that rarely offered any. The rose waited on my windowsill like a dare tonight. No card, no ribbon, just white petals against gray stone. I told myself wind or staff left it by accident. Still, I carried a glass, filled it, set it down. Morning light turned the petals soft gold, almost forgiving today. Dominic had left before sunrise, and the apartment stayed quiet. Only a rinsed cup and cedar scent marked his passage. I hated noticing, yet my body kept taking inventory anyway. By noon I forgot, until Tuesday returned and I remembered. The first Tuesday taught me kindness can arrive wordless sharp. The second Tuesday brought another rose, placed with identical precision. Same ledge, same silence, as if the air held secrets. I refused to ask Marion, refused to ask Dominic too. Questions feel like surrender when you have lived cornered before. Instead, I trimmed nothing, just set it beside the first. The rose dried, petals papery, still stubbornly intact there. I began hearing elevator hum as my private clock nightly. At 6:42, he left. At night, he returned late. I learned doors by sound, office click versus terrace slide. The second Tuesday made coincidence harder and hope more dangerous. By the third Tuesday, my denial sounded thin in me. The rose arrived again, stem damp, cut clean, no message. I lifted it carefully, as if it could bruise feelings. My phone showed Emmy's school photo, her smile missing teeth. I whispered I was coming soon, though soon stayed uncertain. Dominic's schedule stayed brutal, and yet he never forgot Tuesdays either. In the kitchen, the museum lights dimmed after midnight, softer. Sometimes I caught him there, shoulders loose, eyes tired, silent. We shared space like strangers guarding wounds, not naming them. The third Tuesday didn't change us, but it shifted gravity. One night he cooked pasta, simple, garlic, olive oil, warm. He left the pot on low, as if expecting company. I served myself without asking, refusing to make it romantic. The smell filled the kitchen, cutting through Marble's coldness finally. He worked at the counter, sleeves rolled, eyes on screens. I ate slowly, listening to the quiet between our breaths. For once, silence felt safe, like snow buffering city noise. He didn't ask about me. I didn't ask about him. Yet his presence stayed, steady as a hand near fire. When he left, the kitchen kept warmth, and I noticed. Later I called Emmy, voice light, heart heavy, practiced again. She talked about spelling tests and a new purple backpack. I pictured her small shoulders, and my chest tightened softly. I kept my words steady so she could stay fearless. Behind me, I sensed Dominic passing, then pausing near doorway. He didn't interrupt. He didn't announce he had heard anything. That restraint felt like respect, and it unsettled me deeply. After the call, I stood still, phone warm in palm. I imagined him learning Emmy's name as a quiet promise. Motherhood makes you suspicious of gifts, yet hungry for them. The days settled into patterns I never agreed to study. Elevator up, door click, coffee cup, then the cedar trace. I started timing my breathing to those rhythms without meaning. It scared me how quickly my body learned his schedule. What kind of man gives tenderness anonymously, then hides afterward? I found myself watching the terrace door, waiting for solitude. Some nights he stood outside, city lights reflecting in glass. I stayed inside, pretending the view mattered more than him. In my room, the roses gathered in one narrow vase. 3 blooms, no explanation, yet the quiet felt less empty. On the 4th rose, I noticed stems were angled alike. Same clean cut, same length, like someone measured with care. That detail ended my excuses more than any grand gesture. This was ritual, repeated on purpose, performed in silence weekly. I wondered what Tuesday meant to Dominic, and why roses. Grief has anniversaries. So does fear, so does survival too. And I remembered dog-eared poems and midnight terraces and his stillness. Somewhere inside this penthouse, a locked door held answers waiting. I didn't go looking, but I felt it beside me. The ritual made his distance feel deliberate, not dismissive anymore. When the petals dried, I saved them in a book. Not a poem, but a planner, because I'm practical usually. Still, I moved the vase to my desk without thinking. The office corner smelled faintly sweet, like permission to breathe. I caught myself smiling, then scolded myself for it immediately. Wanting is dangerous. It makes you forget your exit routes. Yet I wanted answers, and I wanted him to heal. His silence wasn't empty. It was packed, pressed, sealed tight. I lived beside that sealed place, brushing it every day. Soon I would knock something loose, and nothing would fit. I was reaching for a spare blanket in the hallway closet when the whole night shifted. The shelf was too high, the chair too narrow, and my fingers were still clumsy from thinking about roses and rituals I refused to name. I stretched, felt fabric, then my elbow bumped something hard and hidden behind the linens. A dark box slid forward like it had been waiting for one careless move. I grabbed for it and missed. It hit the floor with a blunt, private thud, the lid popping loose, and the contents scattered across the hardwood in a quiet avalanche. I froze on the edge of the chair, staring at the mess as if it belonged to someone else. My first instinct was to sweep everything back into place and pretend the box had never existed. I told myself I was not snooping, just cleaning up my mistake, restoring order before Dominic came home. I knelt and began gathering papers one by one. A cufflink rolled to my knee, a key fob, a folded receipt. Then my fingers closed around a photograph, and my breath caught before I could stop it. Dominic was in it, younger, his face turned toward the camera mid-laugh, real laughter that crinkled his eyes. Beside him stood a woman with dark hair and an open smile. Her arm looped through his like she belonged there. The joy between them looked effortless. I set the photo down as gently as if it could shatter. Under it lay a small bundle of envelopes tied with a rubber band gone brittle with age. The handwriting was confident, looping, intimate. On the top envelope, a single name sat like a bruise: Sabrina. I didn't open anything. I didn't need to. Beneath the letters was a newspaper clipping folded into a tight square. When I unfolded it, and the headline gave me the truth in one cold line: a late-night crash on an upstate highway, a young woman gone, a powerful man surviving. My stomach hollowed, Suddenly the dog-eared poems, the midnight terrace, the way Dominic held silence like a shield, the Tuesday roses placed without credit, all of it rearranged inside my chest. I had been reading him as cruel because cruelty is simpler than grief. Scar tissue makes people hard, not heartless. I sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of a love he had buried and kept carrying anyway. The elevator hummed, and the sound sliced through my thoughts. I barely had time to gather the letters into a pile before the doors opened down the hall. Footsteps approached, measured and familiar. Dominic appeared in the doorway and stopped when he saw me kneeling among the scattered pieces of his past. His eyes moved from the floor to the photograph still in my hand, and something raw flashed beneath his composure, then vanished. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm. He crossed the hallway as if each step required discipline. I whispered an apology that felt too small for what I had touched. I held the photo out, and for a breath our fingers hovered close, the heat of his hand making the air feel thinner. He took it with careful precision, not like a man reclaiming property, but like someone handling a live wire. He gathered the clipping, the letters, the small objects, arranging them back into the box with surgical care. When he finally lifted the box, he held it against his chest with both arms, as if letting it go would split him open. The hallway stayed painfully quiet. The city outside kept moving, indifferent, while we stood inside a moment that felt like confession without words. I wanted to explain myself, to promise I would forget what I'd seen, but promises like that would have been another kind of theft. Instead, I stayed where I was, hands empty, eyes steady. I let him see that I wasn't there to use his wound. He stared at the floor for a long time, jaw working once as if he swallowed something sharp. When his gaze finally lifted, the usual wall was still there, but cracked. Light slipped through that crack, and it hurt to witness. He didn't tell me to leave. He didn't ask me to stay. Yet he didn't walk away, and in his world, that was an answer. After he carried the box down the hall, I listened to the soft click of a door, and the apartment seemed to hold its breath. I gathered the last stray paperclip and stood, legs stiff, and heart rearranged. The roses on my desk suddenly made sense in a way that frightened me. They weren't flirtation. They were practice, or penance, or both. I understood then that his distance had never been indifference. It had been survival dressed as control. Later, my phone buzzed with a new calendar entry Marion had added. A flight to Chicago. 2 days. A spouse required. I stared at the screen, realizing the invisible line between us had already been crossed. Chicago would not let us pretend otherwise. Not this time anyway. Chicago happened because Dominic needed legitimacy on a stage that didn't forgive rumors. The conference was about a new urban renewal project. Clean money meant to look clean, and the board wanted a wife beside him in every photo. I boarded the early flight with my suitcase under my knees and my stomach tight, still thinking about the box in the hallway. Dominic sat across the aisle, reading briefs like they were armor. He didn't look at me often, but every time he did, it felt like he was checking that I hadn't vanished, and I was still choosing him. We landed under a gray sky, and the wind off the lake hit like a warning. The car ride to the hotel was quiet, the kind that keeps you from saying the wrong thing. At the front desk, the clerk smiled and handed over one packet. 1 room, 1 king bed, a sitting area with a sofa that was expensive but not generous. Heat rose to my face and I waited for Dominic to correct it. He didn't. He nodded, took the cards, and went upstairs as if discomfort was another detail to manage. Inside, he set his bag down, loosened his tie, and chose the sofa without hesitation. The next morning, the conference center smelled of coffee and fresh carpet. Dominic moved through it with that same controlled calm, but now I saw what powered it. He didn't charm the room. He commanded it with clarity, His slides were clean, his numbers sharp, his voice steady enough to make people lean in. I sat in the second row beside spouses and assistants, smiling when cameras passed, yet my attention stayed on him. He looked like a man carrying a city on his shoulders and refusing to let it shake. Respect arrived first, unwanted and undeniable inside my chest. By late afternoon, the formal obligations ended, and we walked along the lakefront because standing still felt too intimate. Chicago wind cut through my coat and brought tears to my eyes I pretended were from cold. Dominic kept his collar open, as if weather didn't get a vote around him. We spoke in fragments, not flirtation, more like two tired adults comparing scars without touching them. I mentioned Emmy once, and he didn't flinch at the reality of a child in his world. When did I start measuring safety by the distance between us? Snow began to drift, light and hesitant, softening the city's hard edges for the first time. We ducked into a narrow jazz bar that felt like a secret, low ceiling, dark wood, and music that wrapped around you instead of shouting. The bartender set 2 glasses down without asking questions, and I realized Dominic had been here before, or people simply sensed his authority. We talked about books, architecture, and why some people build walls so perfect they forget the view. He listened, really listened, on not the polite silence of a man waiting to speak, but a tension that stayed on my face. The warmth in that room didn't come from heaters. It came from being seen without being hunted, and I forgot exit plan for once. Outside, the snow had thickened into a fine veil, and sidewalks shone with wet light. My shoes were wrong for it, and I knew it, but pride kept me quiet. Half a block from the hotel, my foot slid on a slick patch, and my balance vanished for a breath. Dominic's hand caught my elbow instantly, steady and certain, like reflex. He didn't pull me close, but he didn't let go right away either. We walked the last stretch with his fingers still there, light pressure through my sleeve, and my skin registering every second. Back in the room, the silence felt warm instead of empty for the first time. He worked at the small desk until late. Then the laptop clicked shut and the room softened. I read in bed, pretending pages mattered more than the shape of him on the sofa. Sometime after midnight, his breathing changed, deeper, unguarded, and I looked over to see his face relaxed, years younger without its discipline. A strand of hair fell across his forehead. I stood quietly, took the extra blanket from the foot of the bed, and crossed the carpet. I draped it over him with careful hands, and the tenderness of that motion shocked me. Love arrived like recognition, and fear followed immediately because New York would freeze this. Early morning we flew back, and the cabin light felt harsher than Chicago snow. Dominic returned to work mode the moment the seatbelt sign chimed, phone out, shoulders set, eyes on screens, and I watched the change spread across him like frost on glass. First at the edges, then sealing the center. He answered messages with the calm of a man who could afford distance. I matched him because I had learned that reaching for warmth too soon turns it into shame. The city waited at the other end, and so did his walls. I sensed them rising and braced quietly. New York met us with its usual indifference, a gray sky, cold air, and traffic noise that never fully stops. On the flight home, I watched Dominic put his armor back on piece by piece. His shoulders squared, his gaze flattened, his attention sliding past me the way it had before Chicago. I matched him because I had learned a hard rule: never reach for someone who is already stepping away. In the car ride back to the Upper East Side, he answered messages, and then I stared out at the blur of buildings, pretending my chest was not aching. The penthouse welcomed us like a museum again. Clean lines, silent corners, nothing left out of place. I set my suitcase in my room and went straight to work, opening my laptop in the small office I had claimed as mine. Meetings, spreadsheets, polite emails, the steady rhythm of consulting that kept me moving. Dominic kept longer hours. Some nights I heard his elevator. Some nights I only noticed the faint cedar trace near the entry. I told myself this was fine. I was good at fine. It lasted 11 days before the hallway got too narrow. I stepped out toward the kitchen at the same moment Dominic came out of his office. We both shifted left, then both corrected right, and suddenly we were close enough to feel the air change. Not touch, just proximity, and in the absurdity of two adults trapped by timing. My pulse spiked. I murmured an apology I did not mean, and walked past him like nothing happened, then drank water at the sink with the focus of someone trying to erase a moment. 2 days later, it was the bookshelf. I reached for an architecture book I had seen in Chicago, wanting proof that warmth had existed. Behind me, Dominic crossed the room without speaking. His hand came past my shoulder for the same spine, and his forearm hovered along mine, close enough that heat radiated through fabric and made my breath catch. He did not press against me, but I could have leaned back and found him. I stayed still, furious at myself for noticing how careful he was. He withdrew slowly. I took the book and turned, and his expression looked like pressure beneath ice. The words left my mouth before I could soften them. I told him I had seen the pattern, the roses, the books, the quiet gifts that arrived without explanation. I did not accuse. I did not beg. I simply named what was happening between us. For a second, something opened in his eyes, a door inching wide enough for light. Then he shut it, glancing toward his phone like it could save him. He retreated into work, saying he had a call, and the office door clicked closed with final precision. I sat on the sofa holding a book I had already read, heart beating like I had run. Later, Marion passed through with fresh linens. In her brisk voice, she referenced the roses as the Tuesday tradition, then caught herself and smoothed her expression back into professionalism. That slip landed harder than any confession. It meant this ritual existed before me, and Dominic had carried it alone. That night I couldn't sleep. The city hummed beyond the glass, and the penthouse felt like a countdown, each quiet minute tightening around my ribs. I kept hearing Chicago snow in my memory, softening edges, and I kept hearing the absence here, sharp and polished. What do you do when someone gives you warmth, then acts like it never happened? Around 1:14 in the morning, the elevator engaged, a familiar mechanical sigh, and my eyes opened before I chose to wake. Footsteps crossed the foyer slower than usual. Then a pause near the kitchen. Then silence, wrong in a way my body recognized. I sat up, heart already bracing, and swung my feet to the floor, following that wrongness down the hallway because mothers don't get to ignore it. The hallway was cooler than it should have been, as if the building had exhaled. I moved without turning on lights, guided by the pale city glow. The kitchen door was half open. I saw his outline at the sink, shoulders rigid, hands braced, still wearing his coat. He did not look up when I entered, which meant he had not heard me. That scared me more than any raised voice. I took one more step toward him anyway. At 1:14 in the morning, the elevator engaged, a low mechanical hum that I had learned to ignore. Tonight, it didn't fade into routine. It stopped, and the silence that followed felt wrong, like a room holding its breath for bad news. I sat up before I decided to, feet finding the floor with the same reflex that used to wake me when Emmy coughed behind a closed door. The hallway was dim, outlit only by the city leaking through glass. I moved without turning on lamps, listening. No office door, no phone, just a slow scrape, then nothing. When I reached the kitchen, Dominic was there at the sink, coat still on, both hands braced on the counter as if he was keeping himself upright. He turned slightly, and the pale light caught a thin cut above his cheekbone, fresh enough to shine, with a bruise beginning to bloom beneath it. My fear sharpened into focus. I didn't ask permission. I told him to sit, the way I used to tell panicked teenagers in the clinic to sit before they fainted. He hesitated, pride fighting practicality, then lowered himself onto a stool. Up close, he looked tired in a way money can't fix, jaw tight, eyes frayed at the edges of control. I opened the cabinet above the sink and pulled down the first aid kit I had noticed weeks ago. The zipper sounded loud in the quiet. Cotton pads, antiseptic, closure tape, a small pair of scissors. I filled a bowl with water and set it beside him. My hands moved with muscle memory, steady even while my chest kept arguing that this was too intimate for two people pretending to be strangers. I dabbed at the cut, gentle but firm. The antiseptic stung. His eyelid tightened once, a tiny tell he couldn't fully hide. He tried to wave it off with a minimal shrug, but I kept working because pretending injuries are nothing is how problems grow. I asked what happened in a calm tone, and he gave me the outline without details. An old disagreement, someone crossing a line, a boundary that needed reminding. The words were careful, but the fatigue in his posture told me the night had cost him. As I cleaned, I noticed things distance had blurred, a faint line beside his mouth from holding back words. The way his hair was slightly disordered, not the exact arrangement he wore in daylight. The warmth of his skin under my fingertips, surprising in a man who lived like stone. I wondered when my fear for him started sounding like love, and hated myself for the thought. He watched me with an attention that didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like he was letting himself be seen. Then, softly, he asked about Emmy. Not about the bills or the contract, but about her, as if her small lungs mattered more than leverage. I told him the truth. Her asthma was better with the new treatment plan, but the appointments were constant, and my ex was using every missed pickup as a weapon. I admitted I kept the ugliest parts hidden from her because children deserve steadiness, not adult panic. His gaze held mine, unguarded for a beat. In that beat, a detail clicked. Last week, my email had shown a payment posted to the hospital portal, labeled as an anonymous contribution. I had assumed it was a charity fund, a paperwork miracle. Now I recognized the timing, the precision, the way my stress had eased without explanation. I didn't accuse him. I simply understood, and the understanding landed heavy. He had helped without announcing it, not to own me, but to remove pressure from Emmy's chest and from mine. I pressed the final strip of closure tape into place, careful with the angle. When I leaned back, he caught my wrist lightly, my fingers wrapping around the inside where my pulse jumped. It wasn't force. It was a question, a plea, a quiet request that I stay in the moment and not retreat into gratitude or pride. I froze, breathing shallow, aware of how close we were in the blue-gray kitchen light. His thumb rested near my pulse as if he could feel how fast it raced. He looked at me like he had walked through every wall he owned and found none left. My name left his mouth, low and careful, the way you handle something fragile and precious at once. And I knew, with a sudden certainty, that tomorrow would not be ordinary at all, because men like Victor Vale do not tolerate cracks in the armor. His hand released mine, but the imprint stayed, a warm ring on skin. I finished wiping the counter, threw away the cotton, and watched him stand, slower than usual. The bruise on his cheek looked darker under the window light. When he disappeared down the hall, my phone already lit with a calendar alert for late morning, a meeting I hadn't scheduled, at an address on Park Avenue. The name attached to it was Victor Vale. Tuesday morning arrived too quietly for what had happened at 1:14 in the morning. The penthouse looked the same in daylight. Glass, marble, distance. Yet my skin still remembered the warmth of Dominic's fingers at my wrist. I was in my small office with coffee cooling beside my laptop when my phone buzzed. A new entry had been added to the shared calendar under my name. An 11 o'clock meeting, a Park Avenue address, and the name Victor Vale. No note, no context, just a pin dropped into my day like a threat. And I went because motherhood has taught me that danger grows when you pretend it isn't there. The law office took up 3 floors of a building designed to make people feel small. Victor sat at the head, flanked by 2 attorneys and a younger aide with a tablet. The room smelled like money and antiseptic air. He was older than Dominic, the same hard jawline without any of the restraint. His eyes landed on me the way you look at a problem you plan to solve efficiently. He began laying out facts, each one sharpened to cut. My marriage, he explained, had become a liability. Board members wanted reassurance. Rivals wanted leverage. The story of how Dominic acquired a wife was no longer a private arrangement. It was a loose thread in a room full of hands. He knew more than he should have. He referenced Emmy's hospital visits as if they were line items, my custody dispute as if it were a negotiation tool. He hinted at how easy it would be for the right reporter, the right rival, the right judge to see my life in harsh light. Public scrutiny, he implied, would destabilize Dominic's position in both his legitimate world and the shadow one he never named. I felt my stomach tighten, not from fear for myself, but from the image of Emmy's small face in a headline she could one day read. Victor slid a folder across the table. Inside, I knew, would be numbers big enough to buy comfort and silence. His offer was simple in its cruelty. Disappear, sign a confidentiality agreement, and Dominic's original financial terms would be honored, with extra compensation for my discretion. He framed it as kindness, as protection, as business reality. I kept my hands folded in my lap and did not open the folder. I stood, smoothed my coat, and left with my spine straight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shake. Outside, the city air tasted colder than it had an hour earlier. Back at the penthouse, I moved through rooms like a ghost, pulling my suitcase from the closet. Packing is what I do when the world corners me. I folded clothes with methodical calm, stacked books with careful edges, and tried not to think about the way Dominic's kitchen had felt warmer in Chicago. I realized how little I owned here. The only things that truly belonged to me were the feelings I couldn't pack. I stopped at the desk where the vase sat. 4 white roses, dried petals curling inward, still beautiful in a fragile way. I touched one stem, then withdrew my hand, and they weren't mine to take. They were evidence of a language I had not earned the right to claim. I left them where they were and kept packing, swallowing the grief of leaving something I had never been supposed to want. Dominic came home after dark. I heard the elevator, the familiar hum, then his footsteps in the hallway. He appeared in my doorway and his gaze went straight to the suitcase on the bed. The air changed. Control tightened and then fractured, a door slamming on something newly awake. He stepped in and closed the suitcase with one hand, palm flat on the lid, stopping my next folded sweater midair. I lifted my eyes and saw the exact color of his, darker than the skyline at dusk. I told him, in the simplest terms I could manage, that his father had offered me money to vanish. I told him Victor would expose the contract on my debt, Emmy's medical history, my custody vulnerability. I told him leaving was practical, that I was trying to protect him from inquiry, from board pressure, from the kind of scandal that becomes a weapon. I did not say I was afraid of losing him, because fear makes you sound like you are asking for permission to hurt. He moved closer, not threatening, just decisive, and I felt the heat of him in the small space. The words he didn't say mattered more than the ones he did. His hand came up to my face, fingertips along my jaw like he was confirming I was real, and then he kissed me with a steadiness that felt like a decision. It was the moment a man stops pretending he can live without something. For a few seconds I let myself exist there, held by certainty, until reality returned like a blade. A love does not stop powerful men from using children as leverage. I waited until he fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by whatever battle he had fought all day. Before dawn, I wrote a short note on the counter, words that sounded calm and broke me anyway. I took my suitcase, left the roses behind, and slipped out while the city was still dark. The rideshare to JFK was silent. By the time I stood in the departures line, boarding pass open on my phone, I had convinced myself this was clean. I was protecting Emmy. I was protecting Dominic. I was doing the right thing, even if it hurt. JFK departures was all fluorescent glare and rolling wheels, a river of people moving with the calm impatience of travelers who believed their own plans mattered. I stood in the line for document check with my suitcase handle pressed into my palm and my boarding pass glowing on my phone, trying to convince myself this was the clean choice. I had left before dawn while Dominic slept on the sofa, his face finally peaceful, and I told myself I was sparing him the board inquiry, sparing Emmy the kind of public attention that turns medical records into gossip and custody fights into headlines. The loudspeaker called flights and gate changes. Nobody cared why my throat kept tightening. My phone buzzed with a call from Dominic's assistant. I stared at it, then declined because answering would make me turn back. I forced my feet forward, pretending distance could protect us both. 30 seconds later, another buzz came, this time a text from an unknown number. It said, Dominic knew, and it told me to turn around. I held my phone close to my chest, breathing through the panic like I had learned to do beside Emmy's hospital bed, and still I moved with the line. I repeated my reasons like a prayer. Victor would expose the contract, the press would dig, rivals would circle, and Emmy would become a story instead of a child. I imagined Dominic standing between board members and enemies, trying to keep his empire stable while my past bled into public view. The line advanced. The agent waved the next passenger forward. I could have stepped out. I could have waited. But survival has always meant continuing. How do you keep walking when the person you're running from is the only one who has truly seen you? I reached the front of the line when I heard my name cut cleanly through the terminal noise. It wasn't loud, but it was certain. The difference between a man performing composure and a man dropping it. I turned and saw Dominic moving toward me through the crowd, not running, not rushing, simply advancing with the steady urgency of someone who had already decided. He wore yesterday's shirt, collar open, no jacket, hair slightly wrong, as if he had left the penthouse without thinking about anything except finding me. People shifted aside without understanding why, the way they had at the fundraiser. He stopped a step away, eyes locked on mine, and for a moment the fluorescent lights, the announcements, the rolling luggage all blurred. The air between us changed, heavy and quiet, like weather forming inside a building. My boarding pass sat in my pocket, and I couldn't move. I told him, with my voice barely steady, that I was protecting him, and that Victor had offered money and threats, that leaving would keep the board from digging and keep Emmy's life from being dragged into public. Dominic listened without interrupting, then shook his head once, small and final. The message was clear even without words. He hadn't asked for my sacrifice. In his face, I saw something I hadn't seen in months, a refusal to be managed. He let me understand that Victor had spent decades making decisions over him, and he was finished. Then he did the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do in public. He admitted grief. He let Sabrina's death become architecture, a reason to seal every door and call it strength. He told me, in plain honesty, that he didn't want to live like that anymore. Not for power, not for pride now. He didn't plead with grand speeches. Instead, he proved he had been watching me the whole time. He reminded me how I carried Emmy's drawing like a secret shield, how I drank instant coffee in a penthouse like it was an act of defiance, how I saved dried petals in a planner because vulnerability needed hiding. He named the Tuesday roses as practice, Tenderness done quietly because announcing it felt unsafe. He described my silences, how I stayed in the hallway after the box, how I argued with his shelves without raising my voice, how I steadied myself instead of collapsing. Each detail landed like evidence. He asked me to come back, not as Mrs. Vale on paper, but as Hannah, choosing him in the open. I stepped closer and pressed my palm to his chest, feeling his heartbeat answer, fast and real. Around us, the terminal kept moving, indifferent. I looked down at my suitcase. I'm at the boarding pass that would carry me away, and I understood the cost of staying was no longer hypothetical. Victor would retaliate, the board would demand explanations, and rivals would test every crack. Still, Dominic's hand covered mine where it rested on his chest, steadying me in a way I couldn't pretend I didn't need. I told myself I had left to protect him, yet here he was, choosing the messy version of protection that included me. I nodded once, and the choice settled into my bones. We walked out of the line together, my flight becoming someone else's problem. In the car back to Manhattan, I watched him breathe as if he had been holding it for years. I knew the next battle would happen in boardrooms and behind closed doors, and this time I would not be a secret at all. Back at the penthouse, the elevator opened into the same marble light, but it did not feel like a cage anymore. My suitcase bumped the floor, and Dominic's hand hovered near my elbow, not guiding, just present. The city shimmered beyond the glass, indifferent as always. Yet the silence between us had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a shared breath. Dominic walked straight to the kitchen, poured water, and drank like a man returning from a storm. I stood beside him and realized we had crossed a line in public. Next, we would face it together. He moved fast without looking frantic. Before I could remove my coat, he was on the phone, speaking in low, clipped phrases I did not try to decode. I recognized only the shape of decisions: legal counsel, communications, security. Marian appeared with her tablet, and Dominic gave her a new set of instructions. I'm all about access and timing. My phone pinged with a reset password for the shared calendar and a list of names marked approved. Dominic's world reorganized itself around one goal: no one gets near Emmy, and no one uses me as bait. He did not ask permission. I stopped him after the second call, not with drama, with a steady hand on the counter and a mother's calm. I let him understand that protection is not the same as ownership. I would not be hidden to keep his image clean. Emmy would never be treated as leverage, not by Victor, not by rivals, not even by Dominic in the name of safety. If my child's records needed guarding, we would guard them, but I would not sign away my voice. Dominic listened, jaw tight, then nodded once, and changed course as if my boundaries were the point. Marian's posture changed after that. She still moved like a rulebook, but she looked at me directly now, not through me. When she asked about Emmy's allergies and bedtime routines, her voice stayed professional, yet the question itself felt like respect. I watched Dominic defer to me on small choices, where the extra key would live, which room would become mine, who would be allowed upstairs. Marian noticed too. The penthouse staff began to treat my name as real, not temporary. For the first time, I felt the museum loosen its grip, one quiet inch, and I could breathe again. Dominic met Victor that afternoon, and he did not ask me to stay away. He took the call on speaker in his office with the door open, making the choice visible. I heard Victor's tone even through Dominic's calm responses. Disappointment dressed as authority, threats disguised as concern, and Dominic refused the deal Victor offered, refused the plan to remove me like a stain. He accepted that the board might investigate, that headlines might circle, that allies might question him. He sounded steady, almost gentle, and that steadiness felt like fire. When the call ended, Dominic exhaled hard and kept standing. After that, practical things shifted. Locks were rekeyed. Visitor lists tightened. A new attorney emailed paperwork for medical privacy, and Dominic had his people route all hospital contact through one protected channel. Marion replaced the lobby staff with 2 guards I had not seen before, men who looked bored because they were good at watching. Dominic moved sensitive folders from his study into a safe I never knew existed. He also asked me, through action more than words, on which school Emmy might attend and which streets felt unsafe. Safety became a shared project, not a cage built around me anymore. That night, when I passed the vase, Dominic paused beside it. He touched a dried petal with the tip of his finger, then looked away as if the softness embarrassed him. In the kitchen light, he let me understand why Tuesday mattered. It was the day Sabrina died, the day his world split and never fully stitched. The roses were not romance. They were a ritual to keep grief from swallowing him whole. He had been practicing tenderness in secret, leaving it where I could find it, then retreating before it became dangerous. I saw ice was pain, not hate. Before bed, we stood at the counter with coffee, shoulders almost touching, and no one pretended it meant nothing. I called my mother to arrange Emmy's return for the weekend, and my voice did not shake. Dominic listened from the doorway, quiet, letting me lead. After I hung up, he set a small, child-proof latch on a cabinet, the simplest gesture, yet it changed the room. I understood that warmth would not appear by magic. It would be built, choice by choice, day by day. Dominic looked at me, and I sensed he wanted to name the roses at last. Morning came soft, the kind that makes a city sound far away. Light slid across the marble counter and turned the coffee steam into a little cloud. Dominic stood beside me, not touching, but close enough that our shoulders warmed the same air. Outside, Manhattan kept humming, but inside the penthouse the silence was finally peace, not punishment. And I used to think this place was built to keep people from leaving fingerprints. Now I watched a dish towel drape over the chair, a mug ring on the counter, a child-proof latch on the cabinet that hadn't been there last week. Small messes, proof of life, proof that someone planned to stay. Dominic looked at the vase of dried roses on my desk, then at me, as if he was choosing the safest way to hold a fragile thing. He didn't perform. He simply let the truth exist in the open. Tuesday, he explained in his careful way, was the day Sabrina died. For years, he had treated that day like a cliff edge, something you approach alone so you don't drag anyone else down. The roses were his ritual, his practice, a quiet lesson in tenderness when his voice didn't trust itself. Leaving them where I could find them was his way of learning to give without demanding, to feel without losing control. I told him, without making it dramatic, that I had always known. Not the whole story, but the shape of it. The relief wasn't in the explanation. The relief was in him naming it out loud, letting it be real instead of hidden behind rules and locked boxes. In that moment, the penthouse felt less like a fortress and more like a home someone had been afraid to admit they wanted. Later, I made a list for Emmy the way I always do when fear tries to take over. Backup inhaler, doctor numbers, school pickup plan, safe contact list. I taped her newest drawing to a low wall in my room, not inside a closet this time. I cleared a corner shelf for her picture books, and Dominic added a nightlight to the hallway outlet like it was the most natural thing in the world, then paused, waiting for my nod. Because this was the new rule. Nothing about my child happens without me. I thought about the version of myself who survived by leaving. I left apartments, relationships, jobs, even friendships, the moment I sensed the ground shifting. I called it independence, but it was often loneliness wearing a brave face. Being a single mom taught me strength, but it also taught me to carry everything alone until my arms went numb. Staying used to feel like a trap. Now, staying by choice felt like the bravest thing I had ever done. Dominic didn't promise perfection. He offered consistency. He listened when I said no. He adjusted when I said stop. He made room for my voice, and then proved he could protect it without silencing it. His power didn't disappear. It softened into responsibility. Mine didn't disappear either. It finally got to rest. That night, I called my mother and arranged Emmy's return for the weekend. I pictured her small suitcase, her rabbit, her wide eyes taking in the skyline. I knew she would test this place with laughter and crumbs and questions. The thought didn't scare me anymore. It made me grateful. Before I slept, I walked the terrace alone and looked down at the taxis, tiny and restless. I realized the world would still be loud tomorrow, and Victor would still be watching. But inside these walls, we had a plan, not a secret. Dominic left his office door open, papers spread, and he asked Marion to keep the staff list tight. I watched him do it without swagger, only care. That was new, and it felt like shelter finally. So here's what I learned the hard way. Love isn't a contract, and it isn't control. Love is showing up again and again, even when fear tells you to run. Who has stayed for you when life got heavy? Have you ever told them what that meant? If this story held your heart for a while, tap like, share it with someone who needs a soft ending, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. This morning, I opened the curtain, set a single white rose on the windowsill, and for the first time, it was my hand that placed it there too.